This is my first go at this, so you guys can, here, give me a hand, Jesse. Tell me how this goes. So, a little backdrop to this. So we've talked about the sum, I know with all of you in 840. This will be, to a great extent, a bit repetitious of that, but it's concentrated and organized here. So why don't, as ever with any of these, but particularly with this one where it's also my first time doing it, for starters, for sure dig in. Like we're going to talk about 3 types of benefits only. So dig into any questions you have, or if you want to extrapolate it to other things, let's go for that as well. We can then leave time either to end early for some of you or all of you, or if you have questions about other items, we can talk about that. I didn't want to load it down and be too overwhelming, because in class it felt tight getting through all of this content. I wanted to be sensitive to if you were going to have questions about some of this content, or we could flex into other stuff that's not in the handout, but we can talk, okay? All the way of saying flexible, first time, let's figure it out, and then I'm happy to get feedback for like, the next time you offer this, can you maybe do this and that? Okay, that sound good? Okay, and so I picked the 3 benefits that are just the clear giant ones. Giant in terms of they're common, and certainly with 2 of the 3, they have clear economic, AKA salary implications. Like you really, really can't negotiate salary without having a sense of what is offered with these. And you can't have a clear sense of that until you make sure you know all the different dimensions, the different facets of what are included typically in these benefits. So I'll walk through those. Are we good? Any questions off the bat? Okay, so again, some of this will be repetitive, and I apologize, it was somewhat intentional, but if we're feeling like, no, we can move on faster or whatever, then absolutely push on that and tell me. Okay, so health insurance, retirement savings, paid time off. General considerations. With all of these, so organizations and even jobs vary a ton in terms of the provision of these benefits. The health insurance reform has taken away some employer discretion, but not tons. There's still a lot of it. And with the other benefits, it is completely at the employer's discretion whether to offer these and how to offer them. So even the first, general considerations, the start or effective date that you're eligible for, that you can get and use these benefits, totally varies. You cannot assume. So for example, my own personal situation, moving to Rutgers, my last 2 jobs, I got health insurance on day 1, which is a privilege that is not terribly common. It is in some settings, public sector more than not. Often it's the first day of the first month after hire, might be 30 days, might be longer than that. And low-level retail, if you're lucky, it's 90 days to a year often. That's not you guys. So I negotiated an early start before the school year, July 1st, because I assumed, not a good idea, and I teach negotiating. I assumed that health insurance coverage for me and my family would start July 1st. Wrong. What I was told initially was 60 days, and it might be 30, but it's still going to be at best 30. And so we're looking at, we may be able to cobble with Eric happening by chance to teach a summer class here, and we'll get like extended coverage after I end. But if not, we'll have to do COBRA, and I totally didn't bank on that. And COBRA is where you have stopped work I didn't actually mention COBRA in here, I realized something to add. Right, when you've stopped work at a given place, and so you get COBRA from your previous, relative to your previous workplace. And it costs a lot of money because you are paying the entirety of the premium. I'll talk about what a premium is in a second. Coming to find out with COBRA, like the setup is, if we're here, it's one rate, $3,500 for the full freight of the regular insurance. We will not be here at that point. It'll be August. So we will pay, potentially, if we have to, COBRA for out of state, which is $1,600, much better, still a lot of money, for catastrophic. Like we can't go to the doctor and have it covered at all, right? So worth knowing too, that's more for when you're leaving a place, right? But thinking about those gaps and knowing in advance then, well, when you're going to a place, when it's gonna start, like when you have access to coverage is important. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But so the start or effective date of any kind of benefit, right? So employers have discretion over when that benefit starts. With insurance, it's discretion in the sense that the third-party insurer, they often set that policy, but the employer is the one picking who to work with in terms of that insurer company. So they're choosing in the sense of which place they're going to use and then what kind of start date they apply. Okay. And then open enrollment. Are you guys familiar with what that means, that concept? Well, you all admit if you don't know. No. That's important. You don't know. So open enrollment. So that's an annual period that's set. It's often like October, November type thing, where if you want to change things, like you decided you don't like your health insurance or the company, the insurer, you want to switch from a fancier plan to a cheaper one. Let's talk about what those are. You can make that change during that window. It's like a 30 to 60 day window usually. You can also make changes, well, they're not changes, they're new enrollments when you get hired. So when it's not during that open enrollment window. And when you have a qualifying status change, you get married, you have or adopt a kid, you get divorced, like other kinds of qualifying events, and it'll be specified in the HR literature at those times. So even when it's outside of open enrollment and you're not newly hired, you can also make changes sometimes, right? But not comprehensive. Open enrollment, you can let her rip and change up all different kinds of benefits at the same time. Okay, so it's worth thinking about that once you make a decision at hire or an open enrollment, you're going to be, unless you have these other changes in your life, you're going to be locked into that plan for at least a year, right, until the next open enrollment. Okay, how are we doing? Any questions about that so far? Okay, so health insurance, so concepts here. So we talked in class a bit about PPOs versus HMOs. So PPOs, that means preferred provider network. I don't think the terms, frankly, they don't mean anything to me in terms of understanding what they refer to, but this is what it means. HMO, health maintenance organization. Group health, just for what it's worth, was the first, or at least certainly the biggest, but I think the first HMO in the country, right? So PPOs, this is, let's just kind of nutshell that we can back into detail. So if you are a fairly regular, extensive, particular, specific healthcare user, you have chronic conditions, very particular conditions, you need specialists, you need or want to work with, the same provider that you have been, like if you're not relocating. You want to have flexibility in terms of picking specialists, picking providers. You don't want to be limited by the whole in-network thing, and you don't want to have to get approval for everything, but you have more flexibility or autonomy over that. Then the PPO is better. A classic example is either even if you don't have that set of needs or preferences, it may be that you have a dependent who does, or you're anticipating, like you have a sense, or you've been told, or you've been having discussions with their basic doctor that, yeah, I think in the next year, Junior is going to need X and Y, or some testing, or some such and such. Then it's probably good to get into the PPO. Now, you're going to trade off for that flexibility, for that greater access where you can do it yourself comparatively, a lot higher cost, both in terms of the premium, and we'll get to what the heck that is in a second, and other kinds of out-of-pocket costs, like percentages of coverage for various care services provided, right? So it's that flexibility in exchange for the affordability, the cost of it, okay? But for folks that have the needs or the preferences, it really, you want to consider that, because if you have those needs or preferences and you go with the next option, the more limited option, you could wind up paying a lot more actually, right? So not in the premium, but in the, like, what you're charged to go out of network to fight for and insist on a certain provider, and then you have this debate about what's provided, and they challenge that and they provide less of it, et cetera. So an HMO, right, so the key features here, right, is you are trading off the opposite. You're trading off the flexibility, the range of choice for lower cost. So the premium will, I can't imagine an exception to this, would be lower. You know, controlling for family, I mean, same family size composition will be lower than for a PPO. But there will be a defined and much smaller network of providers, both main doctors and any kind of specialists. And you will be required not only to work within that network as a first, point of first choice or attempt, but you'll be required to get approval. So at minimum, like a doctor's referral, it may have to go up to the insurance company themselves and then be approved and bounced back to you. So there'll be some kind of gatekeeping process there. Occasionally, you may be exempted from the in-network requirement, but only if it's a situation where they literally don't have another provider to offer in-network. And so then on occasion, they've identified a backup provider who is not yet, doesn't have permission, doesn't qualify as in-network, but they send their folks to that person in cases of, like, their current people are not taking any more clients, right? So a kid of mine was sent to a specialist in that way, where it was a specialist outside of our network, but there was no one else available at the time in terms of prompt care. And they agreed that the need for care was time sensitive. If they hadn't agreed, they probably would have made us wait until an in-network person was available. So there's that, again, that trade-off. The flexibility, is less. The cost is also less, right? So the classic example, or the classic scenario then, is folks who, not to over-essentialize, but folks who are single, who have been relatively healthy, not using health insurance, healthcare a lot. HMO can be decent. Now I'm going to touch on one other option, and I'm going to give a scary warning story about that, though, right? Which you can predict what it's going to be in a minute. So the third option that's emerged is a version of really an HMO, and again, I'm touching on concepts we haven't actually defined yet, but it's called a high deductible plan. So in my estimation, from what I've looked at, it appears to have all the similar restraints or constraints of an HMO, so in-network limitations, but it's an even lower premium with a really high deductible. Like, and you can choose. So at Rutgers, for example, they have two versions of this plan. One is the HD 1500, and one is the HD 4000. High deductible, $1,500. So that means that, I'm getting ahead of myself, that you will have to pay out of pocket $1,500 worth of care with absolutely no insurance coverage before your insurance kicks in, right? So the logic being, if you really, and you're paying the full cost, not like the health insurance patient portion, like you would pay, like if, so for example, with so preventative care still is often covered, like your well child, your well person visits are free or covered. Although actually, that's a good question. It may actually be, you have to read the fine print. In those high deductible plans, it could be that well care, that preventative care is covered, or it might be, nope, any care at all. If you get it and you're still within, how much you paid, and it's under $1,500, you're on the hook. And it'll mean that literally the rack rate, not the negotiated rate, but what the doctor charges someone who would walk in off the street. And those are, $150 for a 20-minute doctor's visit. If you get a vaccine, it's probably $40 a pop, not including the labor to administer. So, like, it's pretty easy to get to $1,500, and then the insurance kicks in. But it also probably kicks in at a fairly more limited rate than the coverage you might get on another plan. So HD 4000, you have to spend $4,000 on healthcare before it kicks in. So it's literally a matter of calculation. If you estimate that you're not going to spend anywhere near $4,000 or $1,500 even in healthcare based upon the last several years, and you calculate potentially that issue combined with the savings differential between even like the HMO premium per month and the high deductible insurance option premium per month, you can make a go of it. It's you only have to do it for a year, and then at the point of the next open enrollment, unless you have a status change, you could switch out of it if you decide it's not good. So you're not fixed there forever, but you are fixed in it for a year. So the warning story, and it's how I will try not to cry mentioning it. I have a dear friend who started a position in academia, healthy young woman, probably in her mid-20s, well, maybe 30, starting off in a new job, and was trying to be responsible with money, and went for, I don't know which one, but went for the high deductible plan. And she was literally diagnosed with kidney cancer probably the second week that she started her job. And it has been financially devastating, both because of the deductible and because in that plan, the rest of the coverage ratio is not good. So that's the risk, right? So, your parents, your loved ones may warn you against that, and there's not, it's a gamble, right? And you only take the gamble for a year, so you can think, well, if something bad happens, it's only a year, and then you can click out of it, right? And there's no pre-existing condition penalty anymore after health insurance reform as there was in previous years. And with the same employer, often that would kick it anyway. But you want to think about, again, the cost and everything else. How are we doing, other than being scary? Does that make sense? Straightforward so far? Yeah.
Is it acceptable?
Yeah, no, we just said question, because this has to be, this is a brand new whole thing, so we need to kind of shape it like clay.
So that wouldn't count as like a status change if you go from
No,
really high
wouldn't that be nice? No. They were, her colleagues and her boss, and I don't know what the status of that is, I should check, we're going to try to negotiate for that as an institution on her behalf, but I can't imagine that would go anywhere, because that's the nature of the risk. Like full information, full disclosure, you signed on to that, right? And that's the risk, and unfortunately in her case, it completely bore out the wrong way. So yeah, it's heartbreaking. Okay, so other concepts. So premium, that is the monthly charge for the insurance, right? And so the employer typically, not always, contributes some of that, and then you as the employee, or assuming you guys are wearing your employee hats, contribute something, right? And you'll see percentages, 80%, 20%, where the employer's 80, you're 20. Occasionally it's 100%, sometimes it's 0%, and meaning employer contribution, and you're on the hook for all of it. And they send you off to the exchanges, like as of health insurance reform, healthcare reform, you're searching at the state or federal level for insurance on your own. There are certain cases where that is allowed by employers, and admittedly I don't know all of them. I believe when the employer is pretty small, they can get exempt from having to provide insurance. So premium, yes?
So the student health insurance plan, you pay the premium all up front at once.
At once meaning for all the months per year, or?
Yes. You pay one big chunk.
Not monthly?
No. That's not normal, right?
No. What? Wait. So what is that? How much is that then?
$1,900.
Very strange. I have no idea why. Maybe because they're afraid you're going to drop out, and then they're going to.
Because I guess you don't have a monthly check coming from them or something.
Wow.
But you pay it.
Punishing.
Yes, all at once.
I've never heard of that, admittedly. No job that I ever had. Not that I've had tons of them, but no job I've heard of has that. Yeah, $1,900. So that's not a horrible premium. It's not great for students in my mind. But yeah, to pay it all once is unusual. Usually it's by the month. But yeah, it's an annual figure ultimately. It's just that they divide it up by month. Yeah. And you do. So we've talked about negotiation, role playing. That when thinking about the ultimate impact financially of the health insurance that's being offered to you, it is helpful. It's interesting to know what proportion of the total the employer is paying. So to get a sense of, is it 80, is it 60, is it 100? Wow. But then you really do want to know the next step, which is, okay, so what is then, what does your 20% translate into, or 10% or 15% or whatever, in terms of actual dollars? Like, what will you be paying for the premium every month? So you want to ask that, because otherwise you can't, 80% of 4,000 versus 80% of 12,000, right? It wouldn't be 12,000, but you want to know that, because that's obviously, very different. Okay, and then the employer contribution we just talked about. So that's what the employer is putting in, and their contribution comes in the form of going toward the premium, typically, right? That's where that goes. Okay, so now
how much are premiums? How much do they vary?
A lot, right? So I said this in class several times because I'm a little fixated on the whole health insurance with my new job. That here for our family was, I'm forgetting now, 200 something for the four of us. It will now be 800 at least per month. Okay, and that's two universities. So same type of school, same type of public institution, totally different. And that's family level. You know, you hear a lot of folks in somewhere in between that for family. Now for individual, you know, in some cases it's fully covered for individuals. Other times I've heard, you know, anywhere from 50 to 100, 150, but it could definitely be more, for sure. And then again, it really depends on what kind of plan and what kinds of, the PPO, HMO kinds of things. And occasionally you go higher deductible, you get lower premium, like all those pieces move together very often. So, did that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sorry, another one based on that. Like, do you have a sense of, because I really struggle with this for figuring out the negotiation, but like what you should be expecting within a social work job in terms of the employer contribution or?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of contribution, you know, my sense is, so, and I'm, you know, basing this on my dissertation, you know, data collection of a whole population of human service organization, you know, a while ago, and then what I've heard since and my familiarity now, you know, like 80% is a typical contribution rate, more or less. Sometimes 70, sometimes more. More is better. But again, then it's so brass tacks. What does that mean in terms of out-of-pocket premium, at least, right? So, you know, that's just going to vary a ton, right? It could be again 50 to 200. I'm kind of pulling that out of my cuff or other places. So then it's really considering, I mean, so asking around is good to get a sense of the kind of normative common practice, but then you also want to then consider how you feel about the salary, knowing, you know, and what you want to aim for in salary, knowing that that will be a regular cost, but not the only one. Also, there'll be other costs related just to health insurance that we'll talk about, right? So the deductible, this is the annual minimum that you have to pay out of pocket before the insurance even happens, right? So 500, 250, like you want this to be a low number, right? So 500, 250, the high deductibles, you know, 1,500, 4,000, right? And that, again, has meaning in terms of salary value, and it has more meaning to you as a healthcare user. So again, based upon past, you can't know the future exactly, unfortunately, but based upon past usage, you know, it may be that with a higher deductible, you know that you're not going to hit that, and so then it's a decent trade-off. Okay, well, the deductible is not such a bad thing because it's much lower premium, and I'm very unlikely to have to go that far into it, right? So you have to know yourself as well as know what they're offering, right? Copay, coinsurance. These are two concepts. It used to be that they were somewhat separate from each other. It was either or, and now they're combined often. So copay, which I, as a type A person who likes to have things as simple as possible to deal with, I prefer copays. Copays tend to be, this is like a flat dollar amount. There's no math. You know, you show up at the doctor's office, $10. Give me a 10 spot, give me a 20 spot, we're done with each other. Have a nice day, good to go. Same with prescriptions. Prescriptions often have the copays, not always. Occasionally they're covered totally, but they'll have and it's a tiered system with prescriptions, you know, generics, might be $5 or $10 if you go for the brand name. And I take something that's a brand name because I had an adverse reaction to a generic because they have mysterious ingredients, you know, that vary from one to the other in terms of the generic. So I have to pay, you know, it used to be $35 for the generic, it's now 100 something as of January 1st. So varying copays, but a flat amount due upfront typically. With coinsurance, so some plans, more often the PPOs, like copays, it used to be years ago, copays went with HMOs. You know, more restricted, lower premium per month, then you had a copay. You'd show up for the visits and you had some flat amount and you're done. And it didn't matter what you had done, it was a flat amount, right? So for the insurance company, profit-wise, it kind of netted it or averaged out. So you might have, you know, lots of things done, testing and things. One visit, still $10. Next visit, 15 minutes for like next nothing, still $10, right? With the co-insurance, that's the percentage basis. So this is this idea that not just for the premium, now this is no longer referring to employer contribution versus employee. This is with the insurance company that you are then paying, you know, some percentage of the negotiated cost. And I'll talk about what that means in a second, of that care, right? So a given visit, you have various tests, blood tests, lab work, test in the office done, and then the actual exam. It's like a base fee for the exam, maybe even a base fee for the nursing care at the beginning. And for every single one of those pieces, there will be a charge. And you will pay 20% of each one of those, if it's a 20% to 80% ratio, let's say. Negotiated fee, briefly, you'll see that because this all gets mailed to you. You don't pay on the spot because they don't have time to think about what all they have to have time to bill for this, right? But you'll get it in the mail and you'll see all the broken out services. Sometimes, occasionally they just give you the one number. And the negotiated fee is simply that between the insurer and the provider, there's been some arrangement of a discount from the rack rate from if you just walked in off the street to get that service. It'll be a lower amount. But so you'll pay, let's say, using the number 20%, just arbitrarily, you'll pay 20% of each one of those little things. And it could be, doctor's visit for 30 minutes is $150, nursing care was, $50, test A was $50, test Z was whatever, and you're gonna pay 20% of each one of those things. And you'll get that bill in the mail. Okay, so you can see why co-pays in general, if you tend to have appointments that have lots of tests and things done, right, different parts of them, that co-pay is a lot better than a co-insurance model where it can really add up, right? As it is now, so example with the state of Wisconsin insurance, my understanding, my experience so far has been that they had a co-pay process system, and they have also added co-insurance. And they have increased the premium. So in multiple dimensions over time, health insurance costs have expanded. And it's in ways that on paper are a little hard to tease out because those increases, they roll out as you go through the healthcare service experience. And then also ending with the point of the prescriptions. As I said, the co-pays on the prescriptions have also jumped. So in totality, even though the premium per month hasn't changed that much in the last several years, they've added these various other bits. So from the outset, getting a sense of, co-pays and co-insurance, how does that work? So not just the premium per month, but what happens after that, like when you actually use, right? Yeah.
So when you pay your portion of the co-insurance, does that usually go towards the total deductible for the year? That's
Yes.
what I thought.
Yes, it does. Or wait, let me think about that. It actually, it's a little different than that. It is that with the deductible, now, I'm like, let's say 75% sure of what I'm saying here. When you have a deductible to fulfill, all of the cost, the whole charge, not 20%, the whole charge for the appointment goes to the deductible. So if you go several times then, and given that you're paying the whole charge, you're going to exhaust a reasonably sized deductible fairly soon. Otherwise, if you were just paying 20% for a while, you would be, so in other words, there's no insurance contribution as long as you have the deductible not fulfilled, not exhausted yet. But at the point where then it gets exhausted, then the 80-20 or whatever it is kicks in for the co-insurance model.
So I thought recently GHC explained it to me that way for like some specialized healthcare or testing I had done, and that once the deductible was paid through my like 20%, they covered everything after that point, like at 95% instead of 80%.
Oh, so that is, okay. So, and then there certainly could be variation, right? What I'm guessing they were saying is that when you met, so that's the next, where did it go? Nope, the bottom, out-of-pocket maximum or cap.
Oh, yeah.
That when you exhausted a cap per year, so the cap is different than the deductible. The deductible is at the front end. You got to spend through that to get into, clicking into activating your health insurance coverage. The cap is the annual max that's applied where once you've spent that deductible, beyond the deductible, I think. So the 80-20 or whatever. Once you have through your prescriptions, out-of-pocket, all your out-of-pocket expenses, not including premium, and I believe not including deductible, but I'm not going to totally swear on that. But your out-of-pocket cost thereafter, once you've hit that max, then the insurance will pay sometimes 100%, 95%, right? That generally happens for me, for our family, mid-December, on a calendar year basis, because insurance almost always is calendar year, right? So it's like I'll fill a prescription, December, I think it might have been like 12th last year, And suddenly they're like, oh no, it's 0, nothing's due. What? Because you've reached your cap. Oh, okay, so I wish I had other things to fill. I gotta go to the doctor ASAP before January 1st. Yeah, so that's what that probably kicked in there. So, and those caps again could be like $1,000, they might be higher, might be lower, right? Okay, and it varies of course per individual versus family. How are we doing? Okay so far? Okay. Is the pacing okay here? Are we getting bogged down? Is it too fast? It's good? Okay, so please. Yes, of course. That's the whole point. Oh, beat that horse. Yeah.
Copay and coinsurance only kick in when the deductible has been met. Like when you pay $500.
Yeah. So again, so this is where my lack of being an absolute benefits expert makes me a little nervous. My sense is that you pay whatever full or negotiated cost of the service until the deductible goes through. Is exhausted, used up, and then that kicks in. Versus that you're only paying 20%. Because the idea is you basically don't have. I mean, you have coverage, but you don't have coverage. Like it's not being used until you've exhausted that, and then it reverts to the 2080.
And you have one or the other, right? Or can you have both?
No, you have both. Like it used to be. Again, we had copay, and I love it from a budgeting paperwork standpoint. The copay, you do it up front. We're done with each other. I mean, have a nice day. I like you and all, but like, good. And I've got no bills after this. We're all set. And the coinsurance, because it's billing for each service provided, it requires a bill later, and you kind of sort through this and figure out if it's right and everything, and then pay it later. So just in terms of just life, balance, it's annoying. But no, with the state of Wisconsin insurance now, you have both. There is both a copay and a coinsurance. Not universal, no, that varies. That is just a matter of negotiated, like chosen third-party insuring, arrangements. Sure. Okay, and then dependent coverage. Admittedly, with the ACA, that might have changed. It's not, in the past, it has not been required. And if it's provided, the employer contribution to the premium, again, that's where the employer contributes. They're not contributing in other ways, but they're contributing to the premium cost, the monthly, typically. The employer in the past has not had to contribute to the same or any extent as they contribute to the employer. So, the employee, pardon me. So, for example, with my the domestic violence organizations that I studied in Chicago, it was very common. Almost all places had employee insurance available, and it varied. 80% employer contribution to the premium. 50%, 60%, and then when I asked about the dependent contribution, occasionally it was the same. Really often it was less, and sometimes it was 0. So they offer it, but if you want it, you're going to pay for it entirely. Okay, so that varies. And admittedly, I did not quite have time to check with the ACA. There may be rules against that variation where it has to be the same now, but it does not. Okay, so at minimum you want to check, yeah.
Just because I feel like I've seen a bunch of plans where it
varies.
Very.
Okay, so still varying, yeah. I mean, again, in some ways people think, healthcare reform, it's all better and standardized now. There's still a really pretty dramatic amount of variation that's allowed. So, okay, are we good to move on? Yes.
So given that, if you are married and each of you has a job, do people have their own health insurances and just not combine them? Is
that would probably be really cost inefficient. I'm guessing that 2 individuals separately, the premium and other kinds of out-of-pocket expenses would be more than combining. Mm-hmm. Right? You pick the better of the 2 and then go with one.
Even if their dependent coverage is not great?
Well, the better means better in the gestalt, right? That the employee coverage and the dependent coverage in combination with the subsequent out-of-pocket costs in addition to the premium, that all of that is better. Yeah, it may be in some cases. It's a mathematical question. It may be that separated is somehow ultimately cheaper than together. Yeah. So it's worth it. You got to tease that out and figure out what's best. I know increasingly the data suggests, and this isn't social work or professional specific, but you have in 2 adult households, you have the far lower wage earning person who nonetheless has access to better health insurance, like better benefits, and so they will go get the insurance in the couple with the lower paid person, and then the other person seeks out the absolute highest paying job, even if it has no benefits, right? So there's just that reality. There's just so much variation in this, right? And the classic scenario there, what dominates that data probably is school teachers, right? And folks working in schools where the benefits that are often union negotiated or on the heels of union negotiations are really good, really solid. And then you have someone in the private sector who just tries to max out the hourly wage rate equivalent so that they're in total the household's income and benefits are as good as possible. So, okay, retirement benefits. Please don't forget these, even in your lovely perky youth. Very important and so much higher impact the younger you start. I did not start young. And not only that, when I started my first job, where I was no longer particularly young, we had 2 little kids, and we had the option to decline contributing to Washington's the defined contribution plan. I'll describe that in a second. We could hold off starting it for 2 years because we had huge daycare costs, right? We had basically the equivalent of buying 2 new compact cars a year in cost. And we felt like, oh gosh, no, we're gonna hold off. And okay, it felt impossible, but it meant that, so not only 2 years later start, and we were not spring chickens from a retirement savings standpoint, but we forswore 2 years worth of employer contribution. At that point, with our ages, it was at least 5% of our income a year, right? That's a lot of money. So hindsight is whatever, but just it's worth trying. Even because a little bit now it winds up amortizing, growing to this enormous amount relative to like a lot more started later. It's quite remarkable, actually. So anyway, enough about that. I'll step off my grandmother's pitch. As we talked about briefly in class, let's review again. So defined benefit versus defined contribution. So defined benefit is what people refer to as pensions. And these are a dying breed. States, they're very common, or most common, not very, but most common in the public sector. Pretty darn rare in the private sector at this point. I think states are concerned about kind of the fixed long-term obligation of funding pensions. I will note, and this is a big political ball of something or other, wax or whatever. A lot of what you hear in the media about, the tremendous burdens and the bad shape that pensions are in, tends to be either far exaggerated, in that many pensions, the Wisconsin one being one of them, are well off, very healthy. Or when they're not healthy, it's because they have been raided. That is a term used to describe when states have dipped into pension funds as kind of a cash cow to fund other things, and then they don't have a plan for consistently, easily, readily, safely replenishing those funds. And then it's an absolute disaster. So that's digressing. But the reason that pensions are such, and pensions are in effect deferred compensation. This is not some kind of windfall that drops from the sky. It is in fact an agreement between employer and employee that the employee either takes a lower salary relative to what they could get either from that same organization or even certainly in the larger external market, the private sector in the case of public sector, or because they literally are contributing to it, like Social Security, so that it's not a windfall. It's actually the employee's money that they put in, right, early on and over the years. The distinguishing feature of a defined benefit plan, so a pension, is that the amount you get at the end is unambiguous. As you go, you can plug in your current salary and your years of service and your expected retirement date, and you know pretty much to the dollar, or at least as a minimum, what you are going to get per month. Right? Tends to be based, so in Wisconsin, it's the 3 highest years of earnings. It may not even be your last 3 years. It could be some point in the middle there. Who knows? But the 3 highest years of earnings. And then you get credits for your years of service, and then it depends on when you retire, obviously, right? And so all of that, the state invests it, And the state, because it has this giant pool of workers that are continually, you've some retiring and then some coming in, it's this steady stream. They absorb the risk of the market fluctuations, like in wherever it's invested. Obviously there's some years that are fantastic, some years that are awful, right? But it's the state fund rather than the individual worker who bears the risk. So what you get at the end of that is stable. That's why pensions have been considered really critical. People argue that it's been this key thing creating middle class, right? That you have this absolute stable income that is complementary to Social Security benefits, right? That are fully external. Well, they're related to jobs, but they're not related to employers, right? Does that sound clear? You're not going to get one probably, so I shouldn't talk any longer about it. No, I mean, if you're in the public sector, chances are you will. Certainly, public employee in Wisconsin and other states, you'll be part of the pension system, the WRS. And defined contribution plan. So these are, this is termed like a 401k plan. Nonprofit sector, the same thing is called a 403b. And this is where you have a plan. It'll be like with Fidelity, for example, or Vanguard. These are two big firms that offer these, where there's money put in, and you then bear the risk. So if you are retiring and you have those in there and the market's been really awful the last several years that you retire, you get what you get. If it's been a boon and it's multiplied amazingly, it's grown, then you get the boon, right? This is why, as I mentioned at least in one of the classes at some point, you have to this day a ton, like way more than is statistically historically the case, of post-retirement age workers still in the workforce. Because when the stock market crashed and with the recession in the 2007, 2009 range, folks who were in these kinds of retirement savings plans, where they were bearing the full risk of market functioning, their 401ks went to zero in value, or they halved in value. And so these folks had to go back into the workforce after their retirement, or stay in the workforce. Yeah.
Do you have a choice about what 401k plan is used, or like where the money's invested? Like if you're someone who has values about where money's invested.
So that's where, so again, and employers are not required to offer this at all. And a lot of times they don't want to bother because it is administratively fairly involved, and there tends to be a pretty low uptake, especially in human services. Like folks feel unable to do it, it feels complicated or whatever, and so they don't enroll. And so for the effort, the employer feels like, why am I doing this, right? But so when they do offer it, there tends, not always, but there can be multiple choices, like a Vanguard, Fidelity or whatever. And within those vehicles then for savings, often, I can't say always, you have some degree of choice in terms of like the socially responsible fund that will cut out tobacco, cut out guns, cut out other kinds of investments. And there, your rate of return might be less because guns and tobacco do well, right? So like the rate of returns might be lower, but it's this trade-off. Again, it's all trade-offs. And then they will typically, again, I'm not an investment specialist, but there will typically be some choices beyond the social choice issue about how aggressive, right? So do you want this to be high risk but high return versus, let's just kind of, let's chill out. And an advisor, and these firms that an employer will enlist will, oh my gosh, it's almost 1 o'clock, okay, will tend to have someone that can meet, these firms will have someone you can meet with to talk about your options, but the variation will be in your basic tolerance for risk. If you just kind of can't stand it, you'll pick a lower risk combination of investments. In addition to that, as you age, it differs, right? So ideally, you are engaged in your retirement savings as you age, and you kind of track that even when you're beyond that job, you'll still have that fund. Occasionally, you can roll them over from one organization to the next, even if it's a different company that administers them. But you will want to shift ideally, so the financial advice would go from perhaps a higher risk option when you're younger to as you get in your retirement to avoid the problem of the market dropping out at the last minute, you will shift to a lower risk, more bond-based, secure set of investments that the fund offers later on. Yeah, so there are often options. And if not, you look at that and you may decide, I'm not going to use this. I'm going to go out on my own and do my own thing. The catch would be that if the firm then contributes something, so they have a firm contribution, you will get that contribution, chances are, if you go outside, right? So there's firm contribution or employer contribution versus your contribution. Sometimes the firm puts in an amount, doesn't matter if you do or not. Sometimes they put in nothing, and so it's all you. And sometimes it's a mix. They'll put in if you put in, and they'll match all of it, they'll match a portion of it. So there's the issue of, they might put in, 5% of your income, right? But they require you to put in 5%. Right? Or they'll put in 5% no matter what, right? So you want to think about what that means, and to get, that's a lot of money. I could calculate like annually, that's a huge amount of money. You just can't use it. You can't play with it, but you can stock it away. But that's a lot. That's not trivial. Yeah.
So does this stuff get like sucked out of your gross salary or
Yes.
whatever, and then what we see ultimately is like this net of like the premiums been paid,
Yeah.
stuff spent.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Yes,
like
it is your, that would be, post-tax or is it pre-tax? It has to embed it's post-tax. Although you can use different, that's where you get into like Roth IRAs versus other, and if you expect to be, you can pursue one or the other of those, and then the contribution from you at least will be pre or post-tax. And you make these calculations based upon what you expect to be in as a tax bracket as you retire. Because these two different types of IRAs will function differently. That's beyond the scope of our time. But yeah.
So you have to like pay the Roth IRA bill every month?
No. It gets sucked out of your, you never see it. It's good to have these automatically set up. You don't send a check in so that it just gets taken out. You never see that and get used to. That's like how many lattes that I'm suffering through not getting. Yeah, no. Yeah. Other? Hi. Oh, Brandon, we're so glad to see you. Here you go. Okay, what else? What do we got going? We have those two kinds of plans. Employer matching, we just talked about vesting. What vesting refers to is the time that the employer requires you to sit tight and be there before you have access, typically, to the money they put in, right? So 2 years, 5 years, where if you leave before then, you of course keep your money, anything that you put in, but you won't get what they put in. So you want to know what that number is, okay? That is typically not negotiable, all right? That doesn't mean you can't be sad about the number and seek to have it addressed better in other ways, as we talk about in class, but typically it's fixed. Let's do paid time off in our remaining, let's try to do this in a few minutes. So this is PTO, this is the vacation, sick, personal. They might have jury duty and holidays kind of on the side. Those tend to be in separate chunks if they offer those. It came up recently in role plays, right? Employers will think about this in terms of weeks sometimes or days other times. And so when you are negotiating, you want to have that in your mind. Hi, Chris. So that you can quickly respond with the right unit, right? So 5 days is 1 week, in other words, right? So you want to actually have side by side both of those numbers, so you kind of know how to, because it's impossible. I don't know, I'm speaking for myself. It is impossible to do even that basic calculation on the spot in that kind of setting. Maybe it's me, I don't know, but I can't do that. So you got to have that, laid out. So a lot of places, I say most employees, I don't know if it's most, but some places, it's separated still. Sick, vacation, personal, right? Other times it's a bank. And there's the trade-offs there too. So the bank system, where it's just paid time off. The bank system tends to be, it lines up with a case where the employer has stepped away from regulating what you're using for what. They're not going to get in the business of doctor's note, why, minimum advance notice, or if it's advance notice required, it's more generous, this kind of thing, right? But my experience, even years ago, with the domestic violence organizations I studied, was the folks that had the banked days, the combined days, had fewer. And I know I mentioned that in class, right? So you won't know fewer, where you have just one organization that you're dealing with. You won't know what they could have offered if it's banked, what they could have offered you if it was separated, or what they used to offer when it was separated. but that's worth keeping back your mind. So you want to think about, this bank day system, it might sound great, like, wow, 5 weeks? But then think about all of the different uses you have to apply to that, right? Versus then add up to another job, which maybe is separated, and compare the apples to the apples. Again, do that calculation of combined versus separated. Accrual rate and then rollover. So accrual rates, that's how fast the amounts develop, and you have both over time during a given year, like with sick days. If they don't plop in 10 sick days in a given year, and they're not, in many cases, not required to offer any of this, right? Occasionally states now and municipalities have passed minimum paid sick and safe days laws where employers have to, but there is no law, like federal law at this point, that requires any of that, right? So it totally varies. But for those exceptions, there's still exceptions. So accrual, so during the year, like if you don't get an automatic, 10 days out of the gate up front, how fast does that accrue? Is it like a certain number of hours per pay period? Is it 1 day a month? Like they will vary in how they give those to you.
So I know that this summer I have a wedding in the end of May and a wedding in the end of July, which I'm going to be required to travel maybe like Thursday through Monday.
Yeah.
And so let's say I have a job next week. How do I talk to my employer about these are places that I need to be, and maybe I haven't worked enough to get.
Yep. So ideally, this is kind of like with a car purchase. You talk about the new car, or new to you if it's used, whatever. The new car purchase first, negotiate that, and then you say, oh, and I have a trade-in. Because if you mention the trade-in up front, you're going to get a crappier, higher price on the new car. I mean, we know this, right? So similarly, negotiate your paid time off up front, and then mention, okay, this sounds, back and forth, whatever, kind of combine it with other things, concessions, and then say, okay, this sounds really good. I really appreciate the back and forth. Now, I do have, these 2 things coming up, relatively soon after I start, and I want to get a sense of what you're, able to do for me in terms of my being able to, I will need to be away for X number of days these months, right? And so ideally negotiate that. It may be that you're negotiating earlier than they typically offer use, like a pre-accrual use of paid time off. Worst comes to worst, you're negotiating for unpaid.
Okay.
Right? If they offer that, usually they have some way of doing that, right? Because if they offer FMLA, that's unpaid leave, right? So not that this is what this is, but they have some way of doing that. So yeah, that'd be how you do it. So accrual, and then accrual rate. So within the year, you have how fast that you earn it, right? When it drops into an account for use. And then there's the waiting period, like when can you first use it, whether it's there or not. And then you have the issue of year to year, right? Does the accrual rate grow, increase? Like, so you start with 2 weeks of vacation, and by year 4, it jumps to 3 weeks, right? Or sick days accrue at a greater number of hours per pay period. So the first year, it's 10 days of sick days, and then by year 3, I'm just making this up, it's 15 days, right? So what is the accrual rate both within the year and then how it rolls out, and then year to year. And the final point, or 105, is the rollover, right? So this is the idea of if you, like rollover data, right? If you don't use everything, can you roll it over to the next year? And typically it's year by year, right? Because it's a year allocation at a time. And places may let you roll everything over. They may have caps. You can roll over this amount. Often they will not let sick days roll over if they have it separated. No sick day rollover at all, but you can roll over all or some of your vacation days. With the bank system, I think I'm not sure how that's done, because again, places have feelings about sick day rolling over and not doing it, partly as a pro-employee thing. They want people to not have an incentive to come to work and be engage in presenteeism, that you're ill, you shouldn't be at work, you're contagious, but you're wanting to save up your sick days. They want to avoid that imposing that kind of incentive. So when it's combined, I'm admittedly not totally sure what the common practice is there. I imagine they if they are going to be inclined at all to roll over, they'll roll over some, but I'm guessing not all of it. So you just want to know what those options are, right? And that is the end of the handout, but I'm happy to linger probably for 3 minutes before puppy checking. Yes?
I have a question. So in terms of sick days, you had talked about a doctor's note. If you are sick, do you need a note from your doctor to tell your employer?
That totally varies. I think that's
Oh.
absolutely crazy. Like,
Okay.
I mean, what a hassle for the employer to enforce, and kind of kindergarten-like in some ways, to
Yes.
be really blunt about it. But there are some cases where that's required, and that's, in some defense of an employer doing that, it may be that's their way of trying to equalize use and access, and if they want to be sure that people are using the sick days for what they're intended for. Again, I think that is not worth the burden on both employer side and employee side, and it's a little bit, and getting to that business of adjudicating that. And then there's the issue of there have been laws passed to make sure employees have the right to use sick days for dependents care when dependents are sick. In some cases, employers don't permit that either. I don't know how they really get into, the amount of getting into your employee's business you have to do to determine whether that's happening or not seems crazy, but it does exist. So that's where it's helpful if there are HR booklets, brochures. Ideally, ask for those and review them up front before you negotiate, because you don't want to be getting into any of that language about, so what do you do, how do you handle? Anything you can learn that's in that category of how is it handled, how is it done, learn that up front. Don't be asking, because that's putting you in a total one-down position bargaining-wise, and it's framing things as employers in control, it's fixed, they can't negotiate, right? You want to avoid that kind of tone setting during that discussion. So, yeah.
So it's really important to me to have a lot of time off every year, and so I just don't know, like, how do you balance out the cost by the employer for my paid time off with my salary, just negotiating that balance.
Right. I mean, you can literally calculate it in terms of those hours of work, like what that cost is, like for you not to be there for the employer. And then there's the logistics issue of if it's a small firm versus a larger firm, if your work is very particular versus other folks there can do it. There's that kind of consideration as well in terms of managing that. I mean, the two main, so doing that calculation, so you have a sense of the actual quantifiable value of that. You got to bring that into the negotiation. I would say that then there's this other category of consideration that has to do with scheduling, schedule autonomy, flexibility, presence, cultures or norms around comp time, alternative or flexible work schedules, like the compressed work week, 4 big days with 1 day off per week, right, the 4-10 kind of thing. With the latter set of things, the kind of scheduling, flexible arrangement things, that ideally is discussion during the interview, because it has to do with the nature of the job, if there are kind of place-bound, person-bound constraints on some of that work, where you have to be there at certain times, or you can't work off-site, because there's also telecommuting or off-site working as well, because you may be able to fashion some of that leave time, not as a leave concept, but as how the job is scheduled, or the time of it is structured. But that ideally is discussed or learned about during the interview. And then you come to the negotiation stage where you can touch on that, where you know already a lot about the pacing, the nature, the timing, the location of the work, and then bring in the negotiation around paid time off. And then if you've maxed out paid, you could also discuss unpaid potentially, if that's kind of, if your needs are above and beyond. And certainly you don't get into that prior to having a job offer, because that, if you're asking for a lot and it's above norm for that organization, then you risk well, I don't know if we want to hire this person, right? I mean, so there's that reality of just balancing, not to compromise your own, what's important to you, but balancing that with the reality of what the employer is expecting or their norms of leave taking. So, and scheduling. That's your question? Is that good? Okay, you don't look very happy with that answer though.
Similar thoughts, but they're very individualized.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm happy to talk further. No, I can't do it today, unfortunately, but I'm happy to follow up with that. Anything else? Y'all look ready to go? You're ready for the rain, Carissa? Okay. All right, well, I'm happy to follow up with any additional thoughts, information, as well as take feedback on ways to elaborate this for the future. So.
Thank you so much.
Sure. If anybody wants extras for friends or whatever, here we go. You sure can.